Good morning, everyone. This is Afghan Nifty. I'm with the Caspian Policy Center. I'm pleased to see everyone at this important event that we are having today. We will be discussing renewable energy in the Caspian region, and I'm very happy to see very important voices and experts on this panel. The Caspian region holds some of the world's largest reserves of oil and gas, and it's well known for hydrocarbon resources. But this wealth of resources has helped create a broad set of international partners and has helped the region to integrate into global economy. However, as the pressure to accelerate the low carbon energy transition increases, the region has been challenged with finding affordable and sustainable solutions to changing global market demands. Record high oil prices and global climate change and energy market volatility have made the low carbon transition all the more necessary. With the potential to produce lithium and copper, which are essential to renewable energy technologies, the Caspian region can help decrease emissions while meeting public demands regarding environmental sustainability. However, the challenge is how the region implements this transition. There have been a lot of interest in the region's solar, wind power energy potential, but we are in this panel, we'll be trying to understand what are the current trends and dynamics are. Political support for the energy transition globally has rapidly increased in the past decade, but this has to be yet to materialize in concrete solutions, not only due to financial and technical challenges, but also due to competing interests over resources. Ecological issues, geopolitical challenges, and securitization of minerals have hampered cooperation between mineral producers and consumers. And in order to reach the emission reduction targets, policies and economic relationships must be reassessed in the Caspian region. Obviously, regional connectivity is also another important angle to look into in the energy integration in the region. As the shift towards renewable energy accelerates, demand for transition energy metals such as lithium, nickel, and rare earths, we need to ask how the Caspian region can transition from hydrocarbon-based economy to minerals, metals, and technology, renewable-driven based economy, and how the Caspian countries do this quickly and efficiently in a way that is affordable, sustainable, and sustains energy security as well. Over the course of past few months, we also have seen certain energy shortages in the region, and it all the more creates more necessity to understand what are the better ways of sustaining energy security in the region. Both the hydrocarbon resources and also the renewable energy can play an important role in this regard. On behalf of the Caspian Policy Center and all of our attendees, I'm happy to have the chance to discuss these issues today. These emerging issues are fundamental to the future of the Caspian region's economies and to the broader transition towards cleaner energy resources. I'd like to thank Robert Ichord, Azhar Iqbal Hussain, and Jandos Temirgali for joining us today. And I hope we can answer some of these important questions and bring attention to the other emerging challenges regarding the renewable energy transition. Thank you and welcome to our panel. And I'd like to introduce our panelist, Bruce Pannier, who's our moderator actually, and also our advisory board member here at the Caspian Policy Center. You have seen Bruce as a prominent voice on Central Asia. I'm very proud to have him moderating our discussion today. With this, I'll stop and give the floor to Bruce. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afghan. Appreciate it very much. And thank you also for setting the table so well. It saves me a lot of talk here. And I'd like to welcome everybody in our audience. Thank you for attending. As Afghan said, I think it's fair to say that when most people think of the Caspian region and energy, they immediately think of oil and gas. But as we are about to hear, the potential for renewable energy in the region is enormous as well. So before introducing our panelists, I'd like to remind everybody that you are free to ask questions by writing them into the chat box and sending them to us. And thank you to our panel of experts for being here. And at this time, I would like to introduce them to you. Dr. Robert Ichord is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, where he's authoring a series of power sector transformation and series on sector transformation in developing countries. Dr. Ichord has nearly 40 years of government service in advancing U.S. international energy policy and programs that include initiating the first U.S. energy assistance programs in Eastern Europe in 1990-1991, and in the newly independent states in early 1992. Dr. Ichord was also working as at USAID as the Chief of Energy and Infrastructure in Europe and Eurasia Bureau. Azhar Iqbal Hussain leads business development efforts in the infrastructure group, covering diverse sectors and markets across the Middle East, Central Asia, Turkey, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Mr. Hussain has 25 years of experience, including 12 at the International Finance Corporation. Jandos Temirgali is Deputy Chairman at Kazakh Invest, a national company that promotes sustainable socioeconomic development in Kazakhstan by attracting foreign investment. Mr. Temirgali has been at Kazakh Invest since 2017, but prior to that, he has a decade of experience in the private sector in Kazakhstan and internationally. So thank you all. Thank you for being here. And we're going to start with up to 7 minutes of introductory remarks from our panelists. And I would like to give the floor over to Dr. Ichord to begin with.
Thank you, Bruce, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in the panel and offer some observations about the energy transition in the region. As you could hear from Bruce's introduction, I've been involved and worked in and followed the region for 40 years, so 30 years or so, since the early 90s. And so I have a particular interest in the transition and how it's progressed over these years. I'm going to focus on the South Caucasus, the 3 countries and the 5 Central Asia countries. Obviously, we have other players in the region, China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, that are critical to this issue. Clearly, the war in Ukraine is affecting the geopolitical landscape in the region and the energy transition. It's a difficult situation for the countries, but clearly they're trying to deal with the ramifications of it in terms of remittances, trade patterns, issues of financial world as a result of the Western sanctions, et cetera. So it's a very interesting time. Energy is central to these considerations. The Caspian as a whole, talking about both subregions, is still in the early stages of the transition to clean energy, although hydro, of course, has been dominant in many countries, notably Georgia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The oil and gas producers still rely for electricity on natural gas, and of course, coal is dominant in Kazakhstan. Armenia has more of a mix of natural gas, nuclear, and hydro. As a whole, the energy generation is fairly substantial. About 311 terawatt hours for those 8 countries in 21, which is roughly equivalent to the United Kingdom generation. And about over 222,000 megawatts installed, but renewables now accounts for about 20% of aggregate generation and 31% of capacity. But the situation is changing, as we'll discuss today, in terms of the major plans of countries to expand their development of wind and solar, along with continued hydro development. So in looking at it, I wanted to emphasize in my opening comments about 5 points that I think are important. I like to start with the issue of the importance of the energy-water nexus in the region for both the upstream and the downstream states. It's critical to both energy and food security in the region in particular. We see enormous changes in the hydrological patterns that have created problems in the region, and the unsustainable water consumption in some areas have had a major impact on this complex and the relationships between countries. I think second, the subregions, as we've heard, have excellent solar and wind resources that can help diversify their energy mixes and reduce their dependence on gas and coal, as well as hydro. And over the last few years, we've seen larger and larger wind and solar projects being developed. In the past, it was like less than 200 megawatts, smaller projects, but now we're seeing larger projects, especially in Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, where they've announced that over the next few years, they would as much as 30 gigawatts will be developed. And remember, I said the overall installed capacity now in both regions is over 22,000. So this is a huge investment requiring, billions and billions of dollars. And but Uzbekistan is really taking off, as I'm sure Mr. Hussain will talk about, and attracting major IFI and investor interest. Third, to really mobilize this kind of investment to meet the targets, will require improvements in the policy and regulatory environment. And this is especially true because while overall we've seen the trend in reducing costs of renewable solar and wind, but project costs have escalated significantly over the last year or two, and the financing costs, supply chain prices, et cetera, have affected these things. So before we were seeing bids of 3 cents a kilowatt hour or less. Now, in a sense, it's going to be difficult for some of these developers, I think, to kind of bid those kinds of numbers in terms of the new projects. And so issues of tariffs and what kind of agreements can be signed will be very important. When we talk about renewables, it's essential to focus on the grid. And while there was a substantial regional high voltage grid developed during the Soviet times with control centers in Tajikistan, in Caspian and Tbilisi, there's a need to modernize and strengthen the electricity transmission and distribution grid to facilitate the integration of higher levels of intermittent wind and solar, as well as to meet the growing demands. I'm particularly concerned about the distribution companies because they've got to improve their financial viability, improve collections. In a lot of the countries, the tariffs are very low and will need to be increased in terms of improving that revenue generation and the overall financial viability of the systems. And 5, as was mentioned, regional cooperation is important. It's interesting, in the early days, we were involved as in AID in trying to help facilitate a parallel transmission agreement between the 5 countries in Central Asia. And so since then, there were problems in terms of the relationships, but now things are improving. But this is going to be critically important in the future with regards to the taking advantage of the differential renewable resource endowments and addressing the seasonal variations in hydro and renewables. And I'll stop by saying that I think that, excuse me, as we look at the future and trying to develop more flexible power systems with high reliability and resilience, the issue of the role of, and the relationship between natural gas and renewables will be critically important in terms of having reliable systems. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ichord. We'll come back to some of the points you raised here when we get over to the discussion. And now I'd like to give the floor to Azhar Hussain. Azhar, please.
Thank you, Bruce, and Bob. Thank you. Your overview that you provided is an excellent segue of what I'm going to talk about. It's my central sort of theme would be the decarbonization that is required in the Central Asia region primarily, because that's the region that I cover. So I'm more experienced to talk about that. So why do we need decarbonization? I'm just stating the obvious, in addition to climate benefits, obvious climate benefits that are out there. The decarbonization would help in terms of increasing the energy security. It would significantly lower the cost of generation, as we've seen. The Bob talked about the 3 cent tariffs of wind and solar. That's pretty much the level at which they are, but they were 15 cents about 5 years back. They've considerably come down. So wind and solar are a part of the least cost generation. And Central Asia is endowed with abundant resources. Hydro is there, which is fairly tapped, I would say. but wind and solar is out there, which is, which has to be, capitalized on, right? And these wind and solar resources are going to provide, one of the least cost generation solutions, to the countries, provide energy security to them, and overall sort of, lower the cost of electricity. And more importantly, since I work for IFC, we are looking at the private sector participation. I mean, Bob talked about 30 gigawatts of new energy capacity that has been announced at its various stages of development. Uzbekistan is kind of leading the pack in terms of the announced plans. But where would the money come from, right? All these incremental capacity will have to be built primarily and should be built with private capital. Now, private capital, would have certain prerequisites, to be attracted, and I'll talk about those in a bit. So the direction of travel will have to be, that there has to be national plans, political commitment towards decarbonization, right? That we are seeing at varied degrees in various countries, right? So Kazakhstan has made plans for that. They have announced a carbon neutrality target. They have an NDC in place. Uzbekistan has one. So that's good news, right? We will need a lot of political commitment in terms of substituting of fossil fuels, particularly in Kazakhstan and in Uzbekistan, right? That also we are seeing at varying degrees of of interest by the governments. So these are all good developments. I would also like to bring out the point that the international finance institutions like us, are and should be a critical partner for this transition, right? We have, we bring in a lot of value, I would say, in terms of our experience. We have experienced these energy transitions in other countries. So there's one big part of it is to share learnings with you. Another part is to support your policy making, right? Because policy, as Bob also mentioned, is critical. That you have the right enabling, consistent policy framework, right? That leads the path towards the decarbonization agenda. So we can, and of course we can come up with the requisite financing, for this to help make this energy transition. So IFI support is critical. As I said, political will is critical. So what is, interestingly, Bob also talked about the grid, right? That is a critical piece, right? So you can generate a lot of electrons. You can, but if you can't fix the grid that can take those electrons and the balancing of intermittent renewable energy, with base load generation, where gas is a key element, right? So gas provides, that balancing of renewables, right? We just came out last week of, our board approved a large gas-fired project in Uzbekistan, which the critical feature of that is that how it helps balancing the renewable energy. Uzbekistan has plans of adding about 30 gigawatts of renewable energy over time, but you need baseload power, modern, efficient, technologically enabling plants and contractual structures that enable, that as the renewables are kicked into the system, these gas-fired plants can facilitate their integration, right? So that's a key element, that will come into play. We talked about replacement of coal-fired plants to gas and more towards renewables, and that's another central theme. And we're looking at ways how do we support that. I mean, it's a very current topic in Kazakhstan, as I'm sure Jandos will talk about. So that's also a part of our plans. So I'm going to state a few critical prerequisites that we have seen time and again. If you want to attract sustainable private sector participation, in investments into energy transition more broadly and into power projects, in particular. So what do you need? We talked about the political will and commitment that translates into a enabling policy framework, a consistent policy framework as well. That is essential. then you need the right risk allocation, right? What is the risk that the private sector should take? What is the risk that the state should take, or the public sector needs to take? In almost all of these markets, we have a single off-taker model, right? So you have one large electricity utility, so in that single off-taker model, there are certain aspects of risk allocation that go to the state, in terms of backstopping the obligations of those off-takers, which invariably are not at a level where they are financially sustainable in terms of cost recovery of tariffs, right? So the state has to de-risk that part, for the private sector investors. So documentation is also very critical. That with all these key bankability features and risk allocation metrics, the documentation has to be as per international legal standards. So that's a very critical element. The procurement process of these projects has to be transparent and done very credibly, right? So IFC, for example, has assisted the government of Uzbekistan recently, in attracting about 3 gigawatts of renewable energy projects, wind and solar, right? And we were very, very pleased to see the outcome of those tender auctions, right? So we were pleasantly surprised that the first tender auction that we ran, attracted a tariff of under 3 cents, right? And the last tender auction that we've done a couple of months ago, we again drew interest from very large, credible international players offering very competitive tariffs, right? We also helped the government in procuring this gas to power project. This is, the outcome was, was one of the lowest capacity charges that we've seen, ever at IFC, right? At 0.6 cents to a kilowatt hour. That's the capacity charge. So to bring home the point that transparent, credible procurement not only attracts international investors, but also draws in financing from international lenders like ourselves. So that's very important. Then in some markets, we are also working on providing access to some risk mitigation measures, like guarantees. The World Bank, provides a guarantee instrument which guarantees the obligations of the state, right? Which is applicable in a lot of markets. Our sister institution, MIGA, provides political risk insurance, which is sometimes very valuable, for international investors coming to a new market, right? So those are essential, tools to do that. So I'll end here by reiterating that the direction of travel is towards more and more renewables. How it will be done is through policy support of the government, commitment of the government, clear enabling regulations. Attracting private capital is key, right? There is abundant private capital out there that has to be redirected to these markets, provided you give them a level playing field, you provide them, with transparency and proper risk allocation. So I'll stop here, Bruce, mindful of time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Azhar, very much. Okay, and we move on to Jandos Temirgali. Mr. Temirgali, could you give us your perspective, please, in your remarks?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bruce. It was very precious, the interventions of the previous speakers. Lots of very useful information. As you know, in general, in the context of geopolitical upheavals, the recent years, we can name pandemic, we can name local events in the region, we can name the war in Ukraine. The countries, the Caspian region and Kazakhstan in particular, they have continued to experience the unprecedented challenges, and this is also faced. If we talk about the energy sector as well, because the energy export for Kazakhstan, for instance, is very significant. It's one of the predominant ones. So, and all these events led to disruption of the established supply chains, regionalization of the economies, and threats of the other kinds, as you know. And many of the imports and the energy imports were linked to the neighboring countries. as well as the export demand. If we talk about aside from the political and geopolitical aspects, we talk about investments. All the parties, they expressed the interest in development of the green technologies in the region. And if we take the experience of Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan started early, several years ago, by upgrading its legal and framework and the policies up to the international level. And we have done substantial amount of work, and just several years ago we have introduced the open transparent auction system for bringing private sector investment, including the foreign private sector investment to the renewable sector of our country. This allowed us to increase the operation from let's say 7 times since 2017, and now we have more than 140 renewable energy facilities in Kazakhstan with a total capacity of about 2.5 gigawatts, which has made it possible to increase the share of renewable energy in the country's electricity generation to 4.5%. Of course, we have our goals, and according to the concept of the transition to renewable energy, to green economy, of the green economy concept, we have a goal of 6% by 2025, 15% by 2030, and 50% by 2050. And then we will become carbon neutral by 2060. That is the plan, which correlates to the plans of many countries. Like, as I remember, China has a similar plan. But let us be on the practical side. Nowadays, our energy generation is dominated by coal and other fossil fuels, composing more than 80% of the entire energy generation in the country. And we need like breakthrough technologies and some large projects in order to increase the green and alternative energy share in the entire power generation. So the government also plans to introduce the nuclear energy plant in our region. And also we announced, as Uzbekistan, as you previously mentioned, we announced several large projects for renewable energy, solar power, wind power, etc. So as same companies like in Uzbekistan, so we work with them also. And we can mention here like such companies as Eni, Italian company General Electric, Total, and others. They are working in Kazakhstan already and have plans to expand their power generation and their presence with large, more than one gigawatt facilities. But also Kazakhstan was pioneering in the region in terms of introducing the green energy concept and green hydrogen in general. We have during several years, with active support by Kazakh Invest, we have developed several projects, and several big names are already announced, such as the Swivind, which is the German-Swedish company. Swivind, they are already operating, they have office, they have operation sites in our country. This project is a $50 billion project, which is designed to initially start in 2030. It is designed to export the green hydrogen to the European Union in the amount of 2 million tons. It's roughly 40 gigawatts. and it would be covering 20% of the EU imports, of the announced EU imports at the moment. So Svevint is not only one company operating in the sector. We also have the Australian Fortescue and other players interested or kind of starting working in this way. And we also believe in green hydrogen as well. So the last thing I would like to mention is here that with the changes in the international situation around our region, new ways of transportation are also evolving, and we can mention so-called middle corridor and the capacities of middle corridor, which is the shortest road from China to the European Union, shortest in terms of, land road between China and European Union, two largest markets for, I would say, renewable energy and for strategic minerals in the continent. The capacity of it just last year, which ran through Kazakhstan, Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and further to European Union, it hasn't increased by 2.5 times just last year. And we believe this route of exporting our goods will be increased further, but exponentially. The challenge here is to increase the capacity of the rolling stock, of the railways, etc. This is kind of technical question. So, as I mentioned earlier, also we consider this green transition in linkage with the strategic minerals. We closely monitor and have consultations with our American colleagues and European colleagues on the. Of course, we have available such strategic minerals as lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and other minerals that would be essential in terms of green transition. And just November last year, at COP27, our government signed the memorandum on strategic partnership with EU, including the sustainable strategic raw materials, supply chains for green hydrogen, and other points as well. So we believe in this direction, and we believe that considering the enormous potential for energy generation in the region will be effective in terms of redistributing it to maintain the energy security, not only in our region, but also to export it effectively to the foreign markets.
Great. Thank you, Jandos. I appreciate it. Okay, and as the moderator, it's my privilege to be able to ask the first questions, and I'm very happy to do this. Dr. Ichord, I'd like to start with you. You'd mentioned that although they built some of these renewable projects, or at least started them in Central Asia, the original thinking was 100, 200 megawatts or something. And in fact, a lot of these seem to be, although they are building these in major urban areas, a lot of these seem to be filling gaps left because the Soviet era energy distribution network didn't reach some of these secondary and tertiary towns or areas, especially where they're developing, strangely, oil or gas. So how do you integrate the new renewable energy systems, especially when you have a bunch of these smaller ones with bigger ones planned, but how do you integrate that into the national grid, and how easy is it to integrate that into a regional grid?
Obviously, this is going to be one of the key areas for negotiations between the investors and the government. In some cases, you have the requirements that the investors do provide funding for transmission interconnections. And obviously, there's a cost to that. I think that the idea in some cases, I think, is that it makes sense to develop these facilities, not only in terms of taking advantage of the best quality resources, but also to try to spur sort of industrial centers, have sort of parks et cetera, that can that are not too far away from load centers, because I mean I think that's one of the key aspects that needs to be looked at here in terms of where is the resource, and what are the costs of developing and moving that to the grid. As I said, there's a high, 500 kVA backbone grid that connects the countries in Central Asia. But there's going to be a lot more investment needed in developing and expanding that higher voltage grid, whether it's 500 or whether it's 200 or what have you, to take advantage of these renewable resources in the locations where you find them. I think, Jandos, one of the interesting issues, of course, is related to Kazakhstan and the fact that you've got a lot of wind resources in the north. The load centers are largely in the south. So, and you've got the coal, Ichord and the coal in the north too. So how do you then, in a sense, take advantage of the wind resources to supplement the coal and to, or replace the coal and to move that power to the load centers in the south? So, I mean, those are the kinds of issues that are country specific in a way, where you have to have a plan for the development of the transmission system that makes sense with regards to where the best renewable energy is and where the load centers are and where they are likely to be in the future if you have minerals development and other kinds of industrial development that will require this kind of power. I mean, looking at countries, for instance, I think Chile is an interesting example, because there you have mineral resources that are not necessarily that are high quality resources, but it's not close to the main grid. So there's been an effort to develop in Chile renewable energy sources to power those mining facilities. So I mean, I think in hearing Jandos and hearing you talk about this issue of mineral development, I think that there are important implications for renewable energy investment that some of the countries, if the cost makes sense, that where they can develop those renewables projects to help those meet the energy requirements of those mining operations. So that's a partial answer, Bruce, because we could go on and talk about other aspects, including the regional grid development, and maybe we can come back to that.
Oh, yeah, and we absolutely will, because that's one of the things I want to get to. And kind of in that same vein, running parallel to that, Azhar, I'd like to ask you, when you are talking to these countries and you're about investments in these renewable projects, I'm curious what you're looking for. One, how they consider hooking this into the national grid, but more broadly, do you do your discussions with these countries, more than one country, looking at it regionally, saying here's your plan, but we also want to talk with your neighboring country about the potential for them being part of this project, possibly only as a consumer, but also possibly because the area that you're looking at has the same suitable conditions on both sides of the border?
Sure, Bruce. So our conversations are, I'm talking of Central Asia, right? Are across all countries, right? So with varying level of interest and support, right? So and our conversations, mind you, as IFC, are targeted at how do you bring in private sector to build the renewable energy or support the energy transition, right? So so conversations are happening in Kazakhstan. Conversations are in Uzbekistan, in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and the good news is that everybody, all these countries, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, are following the path towards decarbonization, right? So big picture, long-term plans, they're there. Where they need support, is to have intermediate steps, right? So you can announce a carbon neutrality by 2060, but how do you get there, right? And what are the intermediate milestones? And that's where we're focusing ourselves on, right? That how do you I mean, this is a very comprehensive and careful planning of an energy system, right? It's just not that you can build renewable energy projects in isolation, right? So as we talked about, the grid integration, that's a critical piece, right? How do you transport electrons? I mean, looking at the intermittency of the renewable energy resources, right? How do you balance it? How much of a base load you would need? What kind of transmission networks would you need? So the conversations, what I'm trying to say, are holistic, right? That if you want to bring in, say, 4 gigawatts over the next 3 years into the power system, then how would the system take it? There has to be in parallel, an exercise to develop the requisite infrastructure or improvements in the grid infrastructure that can take those electrons sustainably, right? So that's important. We are at I would say a more preliminary stage that the right current focus is to nationally sort of decarbonize, particularly in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and we have in parallel started early stage conversations, the need for integrating the grids, right? So that requires planning, right? That how where are the load centers? Where is the cheapest form of energy? Who can produce it? And who can transmit it, right? Is it better to transmit electrons from Kazakhstan into Uzbekistan, for example, rather than building a plant in Uzbekistan, or vice versa? So this would require a very focused engagement and very careful planning. So the conversations have started along this, well received, I would say, by the host governments, that there is clearly a scope. And I mean, it's part of a broader regional, interconnectivity theme. I mean, you should have interconnected, infrastructure. You should have roads, you should have rail, you should have fiber optic, right? Fiber connections, regionally interconnected. You should transmit or transport electrons. So it's a wider conversation that there are significant benefits of this region or the intra-regional trade between the Central Asian republics, right? So those conversations are also happening, and so far, we're getting positive response, and hopefully we'll get a good momentum on this.
Great, thank you, Azhar. And since we're speaking about cooperation in Jandos, your organization, of course, is looking for investment in these projects. Can you speak a little bit about what you're looking for in partners for both for Kazakhstan, but also your level of cooperation with other countries in these projects? If you have something that could potentially benefit Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, or other countries, be it China, when you're looking to get new renewable projects in Kazakhstan.
Sure, we believe in integration approach and in synergies, and this sector clearly has synergy. We can talk about our region in particular, and reflecting on Mr. Ichord's comment on the grid systems and Mr. Hussein's comment on regional integration. Of course, in Kazakhstan, historically, we had, I would say, in Soviet Union, we had north, if we respectively to Kazakhstan, the north of Kazakhstan was connected to the Russian, I would say, Soviet grid, and the south of Kazakhstan was connected to the Middle Asia or Central Asian power grid. And 30 years ago, we had a challenge in terms of balancing it out. And nowadays, we have a unified grid of Kazakhstan, and we balanced out two major grid systems. Of course, it is interconnected with Central Asia and Russia still, but we have our own system in terms of balancing out north and south. In Kazakhstan, it's very, as you know, like climatic conditions in north and south are very, very different. So we see north nowadays, we have still it's winter, clearly winter. And in the south, it's starting like very early spring, I would say. And we believe in Central Asia, we believe in regional grid integration. That's the Kazakhstan perspective. And of course, we have mostly the infrastructure is Soviet. If we talk the mainstream grids, we have good cooperation with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, which Kyrgyzstan has a surplus, and we have sometimes we have a deficit of energy, so we balance it out regionally, or I would say locally, and highlighting the enormous potential for RES for further development of renewable energy. The region faces the task of creating a market for balancing capacities, modernizing existing and building new stations, as well as the attracting investment to maintain the reserve capacities. Through a system of open auctions, investors are guaranteed the purchase of electricity. This auction was introduced just several years ago at a stable rate for up to 20 years, with annual indexation to take into account inflation and currency exchange rate fluctuations. So this is a kind of guaranteed by the government if the currency rate changes, like local currency with respect to USD or other currencies like euro. So this is, I would say, private sector approach, PPP approach, and we believe this system should work. And in the region, we have the challenge in terms of storage of the capacities. And that's another thing we should discuss with our neighbors. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jandos. I appreciate it. And a reminder first to our audience that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box or the chat box so that we can see them. And also a reminder to our panelists that if you wish to add to any remarks you've already heard, you're free to do so and can jump in with any comments you want to make yourself. We do have some questions already coming in, so I'm just going to take these in order. And the first question is, Caspian Basin countries' economies are hugely depend on hydrocarbons. If there is increasing investment in cleaner energies, will it mean less dependency and investment into hydrocarbons? Anyone want to take that one? Do you see that happening? Less investment in hydrocarbons, if there's more in renewable? Jandos, you can start.
It doesn't happen now, but if we talk long term, we should plan ahead. So let us be on the practical side. Well, in Kazakhstan, we have more than 80% of jobs in, I would say, no, sorry about that. 80% of the power generated by fossil fuels. And all these, I would say, enterprises and lots of people working in this industry. So the government kind of sees it as the gradual approach, and we see it step by step in terms of converting to the renewable energy sources. Of course, we need, but in order to achieve these goals, like 2060 carbon neutrality, we should have a breakthrough projects. We should have major projects. The government plans nuclear power station. The government plans huge, like green giants in terms of solar power. So we have all these challenges. So I believe the investment into traditional energy or oil and gas sector is still high. Just a few days ago, CEO of Chevron announced that the company plans to increase its oil production in Kazakhstan to 1 million barrels per day by 2025. Now it's 700,000 barrels at the moment. So the investment in oil and gas are peaking. But talking about long term, the government should invest more into the green transition.
Okay, great, thank you. And Dr. Ichord, this is kind of an interesting question. Ideally, the transition is going over to renewable energy, and that's where more and more of the money goes. But as we heard at the start of this discussion, the prices for oil and gas are hitting record levels from time to time, and they're certainly way up above what they were just a couple of years ago. So there's obviously an incentive to continue to invest in the hydrocarbon field. There's a lot of money to be made for some of these companies. How difficult does that make it to transition to renewable energy?
Well, I think obviously there are different forces at work here. I mean, fundamentally you have this issue that you have the changes with regards to the Russian export position to the West, and that, in a sense, the question is how does that affect things? Now, my understanding is that, and it's interesting with this Chevron announcement too, that Kazakhstan and others have been able to find routes that have reduced their reliance on Russia. And we'll have to see too how China reacts with regards to their demands and desires to tap some of the production potential of the region in oil and gas beyond what they're currently doing. But how does it affect the renewable energy investment? Well, I mean, oil is not used much in power, right? So it's not as key factor as there so much, as although countries are beginning to look at EVs and substitution of oil in the transportation sector. In terms of the gas, I mean, we've talked about the role of gas as a complement to renewables. In terms of the base load issues of development. So I mean that and the development of the transmission system, the potential for storage is important from that standpoint too. I mean, I was looking recently at the plans of all the independent system operators in the US, the RTOs, and all of them have substantial investments in storage, battery storage in particular, as part of their investment plans for the future, as they mainly invest in renewables. So, I mean, the trend that you're seeing is that a very, very high share, and I haven't calculated for this region, a very, very high share of future generation investment will be in renewables. Overall, international, worldwide, we're talking about, over 80% of new power sector investment is in renewables, particularly oil and gas. And of course, the IEA projects that in their forecasts, et cetera. I mean, this region, one of the issues though is the balance there, because you've got the issues of the big hydro investments, and there's still a lot of hydro potential. And we're seeing projects like Rogan and others that are going to add substantial capacity to the hydro side. But I'm concerned that, in a sense, that we get too reliant on the hydro in terms of the system, even though it has positive advantages, especially during the high water areas where you can use, as is the plan for the CASA 1000, to take advantage of that surplus hydro for export and to meet needs of neighboring countries. But during the winter months, you have this problem, right, of especially in the hydro states in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where they've had to use coal, to meet the winter needs in very, inefficient plants. So I think there you've got an opportunity to substitute for oil. For coal, definitely in meeting some of those needs. So I don't know, I think the broader political and regulatory environment is going to be more important factor than the oil and gas development, exploration and production with regards to the evolution of the power sector.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I'm going to let you have a crack at the next question first, and then I'll ask Azhar about this too. We have a question from outside. How can the US, in partnership with the EU and IFIs, most effectively support renewable energy development in countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, given the growing influence that Russia and China have in the energy sectors of these countries?
Well, I think that, I mean, the donor community, and Mr. Hussain can talk more about that than I can in terms of the current environment. But I mean, there has been, you know, substantial donor interest in the region. You know, certainly AID has been pursuing the Power Central Asia project that has been working with the countries to try to improve the regulatory environment, promote the renewables and regional cooperation. There was a big regional meeting in Kazakhstan last fall of this project and counterparts. But clearly the IFI investment has been essential in terms of both the stimulus to these developments, whether it's through even, you know, the IFI work on auctions and transparency of procurement and mobilizing investors, but also the major investors like Masdar and, you know, ACWA from Saudi and others that are coming in for these initial mega projects. And obviously EBRD and has been, I think they've got almost $1 billion of new wind projects that are planned that they're financing and they're just announced. And of course, Hussein, they just announced the big projects in Uzbekistan. I mean, I think it is continued work on the regulatory framework, as Hussein was talking about, and two, the realization that you really have to invest huge amount of money in the grids. I can't underestimate that enough, because, you know, we're talking about, if you're going to do 30 plus gigawatts over the next 10 or 15 years, you're going to need billions and billions of dollars for generation. But if you look at what is needed for transmission, and you look at the IEA estimates as to what investment is needed in the power sector over the next, you know, numbers of years, you're talking about 40% of total investment requirements for transmission and distribution. How are you going to finance that? States are not going to be able to finance that themselves. And that's why you've got the issue of, you've got to have more revenue generation from the sector, so that it is a viable sector. It is not a drag on the economy. And to do that is difficult because it comes up to the issue of how do you structure tariffs. But tariffs of 3 and 5 cents a kilowatt hour retail for households creates a difficulty, and as well as the billing and collection issues in some of the countries. So I mean, that's my biggest concern, is how do you get that kind of environment that's going to allow both the investment in generation and transmission and distribution, because it's a system. You've got to have a system if it's going to work, and it's going to require additional kinds of investment to ensure stability if you're going to a highly intermittent system.
Okay, thank you. And Azhar, your comments on that too. It doesn't have to be specifically talking about how the US or EU more effectively support renewable energy in Central Asia, but how can outside partners support renewable energy in Central Asia, and understanding that China and Russia do have a big influence, and of course they would like to be the main partners in these projects, and if not the sole partner in these projects.
So Bruce, thank you. So as I had mentioned in my earlier comments, that pretty much every IFI is leaning in. We talked about EBRD, us, Asian Development Bank, towards a single focus of decarbonization, bringing in more renewables. And to Dr. Ichord's point, that all these incremental generation is not being planned in isolation. So it's a holistic approach, right? That electrons are to be produced, they have to be transmitted. The distribution company has to sell it and collect, tariff so that there's overall financial sustainability, right? So all three aspects of the equation, right, are being looked at in parallel, right? Because and as I said, this is not that the World Bank Group can solely do, right? So EBRD is coming in, we are complementing each other, right? There are certain like in Uzbekistan, the distribution reforms, the distribution segment reforms are primarily being done by EBRD and ADB, and we are looking at transmission and generation is where everybody's coming in. So it's a pretty holistic approach. IFIs are coming in, they are bringing in technical advice, they're bringing in financing, and they're bringing in key learnings, that we picked up from other parts of the world throughout the last few decades. So that's critical, and that's happening, right? In terms of, if you look at, I talked about transparent procurement, right? And that is a key to attract quality international investors, right? So, and that's exactly what has happened, in Uzbekistan, I can say, because we've been a part of that exercise, right? Dr. Ichord talked about Mastar. Mastar is a very large, serious, credible player, right? It is leaning into Uzbekistan. It has, it's looking at Kazakhstan as well. So very good development. You have a quality investor like Mastar coming in. You have Aqua from Saudi Arabia, equally engaged in Central Asia, right? These are two quality investors. You have ADF coming in, right, from France, right? They are looking at projects in renewable energy as well as on the gas side. As I said, gas complements renewable energy. So you're attracting quality investors. These processes are transparent. Anybody can bid. The market clearing is at the lowest, at the most competitive bid, right? And that's where we are seeing these international investors come in, right? So we haven't seen any major Russian or Chinese participation in this, because possibly traditionally, those interests come in more G2G bilateral, negotiations, right, or bilateral procurements, and that is something that is happening partially, but if you follow an internationally competitive sort of transparent procurement process, then you attract quality investors, and those quality investors are coming in. So that's the key focus for us, that we are, but the needs are so large, in the region, that you can't, build all the capacities through an international competitive bid. So there are going to be some bilats as well, right? And we've seen those bilats, with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with Qatar, with France. We've seen Voltalia come in, right? So those are going to go in parallel as well, right? So overall, I think this journey started about 4 or 5 years back. So far it's turning out pretty well, in terms of attracting quality investors and getting very competitive tariffs.
Okay, great. Thanks, Azhar. And Jandos, let's pick that up with you. Who are the foreign partners that Kazakhstan is looking to work with in these renewable projects? And also, since we've been talking about transparency, could you speak about the legislation that your country is passing to make your country a more attractive investment partner, source of investment, or destination of investment for these projects?
Oh, sure. As Mr. Hussain mentioned, all of these names are very familiar for Kazakhstan, and all these large players. Of course, we're in talks with them, and there are many others as well, of course. It is very true that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are being very active in the region. We observe how renewable energy is developing in neighboring Uzbekistan. The government is actively working on the goal of bringing the share of renewable energy in the country's total electricity production to 25% by 2026, just in 3 years. Works are underway to build 4 gigawatt facilities and solar and wind power plants with participation of large investors. Of course, similar projects will launch in Kazakhstan as well. And I strongly believe that the region needs modern, infrastructure, joint infrastructure. Well, in terms of transmission and in terms of storage as well. And these for such large projects and the new challenges, there should be the large infrastructural projects, because we're all close neighbors, and of course our systems should be very closely interrelated to each other. Also, I wouldn't say that our market, if we talk about Kazakhstan, is dominated, renewable energy market is dominated by Russian or Chinese companies. Mostly we see players from the Western countries and from the Middle East. And some of the names are mentioned, and some of the names Mr. Hussain has mentioned. And these companies are being very active, and we are strongly interested not only like or just simply increase the capacities, but also to increase the transfer of the technologies to this sector. The current approximate tariff for the solar or wind power is roughly 3 cents, 3 to 4 cents at the moment for the latest auctions. Of course, it is kind of, this is one way of doing business. Is the government procurement is fully transparent, and both local and foreign companies can participate in these auctions. But also for strategic investors and for so-called mega projects, the government has introduced just a few years ago the strategic investment agreement, which guarantees the stability of legislation, stability of terms, in terms of tax breaks, in terms of all other terms, in terms of government preferences and all kinds of incentives for up to 25 years. And this agreement is can be signed directly with the government, with the Minister of Energy, and it would grant all these like exclusive rights for this particular project. And that is another way of doing business in this market. I believe for such mega project would be the essential one.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jandos. Dr. Ichord, we'll get to you. We're getting close to the end, and I'll leave some time for everyone to say make some last comments. But Dr. Ichord, I'm kind of curious, what's, since we've seen a lot of work going in right now to repairing and modernizing the infrastructure in Central Asia. Now, with renewables as part of the equation going forward into the future, what do you think should be the next move for Central Asian governments as they are modernizing their grid? And what can international partners do to help them reach that goal?
Well, I think it's important to work, as we've talked about, at both the regional and at the national level. The countries are quite different in terms of where they stand with regards to their both status of system development as well as grid, as well as their financial position. I get very much. I think we should focus very much on this question of the broader system investment plans that are going to facilitate this transition. We've seen some examples that are coming out of the international community has put together in Indonesia and in South Africa that try to take a very comprehensive approach, and where the government takes the lead in trying to, in a sense, really go beyond just the broad policy and the strategy side to really focusing on where the key investments are on both on the demand side as well as on the supply side. Because I think you have to remember that in a sense that's going to be critical in terms of how do you improve the overall efficiency of the system, because you've got large losses that are incurred in some of these systems, in the transmission and distribution, but also in the in-use sectors, in industry and other areas. So I think it's important from that standpoint to approach the question not only in terms of what are the specific conditions of power purchase agreements and procurement systems, et cetera, that are going to be necessary to attract the investment, but also from the standpoint of having a comprehensive and clear framework for the transition that really spells out and includes the issues related to investments at the local as well as the national level. So because you need to focus on the municipal systems, and especially in this region on the heating systems and how it relates in the CHPs or whatever you're going to develop in terms of complementing the electricity and the heat requirements. And so I think that becomes an element, and it also fits into the social justice, equity aspects of this in terms of, are these plans that the government's pursuing, is it going to lead to, in a sense, a broader societal benefit, or is it going to be very focused on certain companies and oligarchs, if you want to say that. But so I think that aspect becomes very important with regards to the Western support and how the West can support these countries in developing ways forward that are going to really support their their social and environmental needs, as well as just the pure energy demand requirements that they're facing as their economies grow.
Okay, thank you. Azhar, to you then, pretty much the same question. What's you've been working with the Central Asian governments? What's their next step on the road to total renewable energy as a power source in Central Asia?
Yeah. Okay. So Bruce, I did mention in my earlier comments as well. So far, I think very happy to see that the governments do realize the need to decarbonize, right? And they have come up with their commitments. They have NDC targets. Kazakhstan has come up with a carbon neutrality target, right? So long-term targets are there to increase the share of renewables or to change the energy mix pretty drastically, particularly in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, away from fossil fuels towards more and more renewable energy. So that's good. Big picture commitment is there, right? They are also following through, as Jandos also mentioned, with relevant policy frameworks, with enabling regulations, how to go about this. Let's remind ourselves this would require a significant investment, right? When we're talking of 30-50 gigawatts, and that's going to require billions of dollars of investment, right? So the important thing, again, is that do you have the right sort of enabling regulations, frameworks, risk allocation in your structures, where you can invite private sector to participate. So far, that is happening, and we've seen, good quality, credible international investors coming into Kazakhstan, into Uzbekistan as well, right? So the direction of travel is right? There will be required a lot of increased sort of focus and attention in terms of continuing this path, right? With the consistent policies, with a lot of political commitment, right? This in some countries, this would require decrease in subsidization of fossil fuel based energy, right? So there are political dimensions to it as well, right? And then Dr. Ichord, mentioned about creating a system that's sustainable for the population at large, right? So the social benefits of this transition have to be kept in mind, and that are a key focus for us as well. Like I'll give you an example. In Uzbekistan, every electron of renewable energy generation is being added at a cost which is less than the average consumer tariff, right? So every electron is adding to reducing, the average cost of generation, and which will be reflected in the consumer tariffs, going forward, because the cost will come down and the consumer tariffs will also come down, and while this would still leave you with some vulnerable sections of the society where the World Bank, primarily because through their policy initiatives, is working on very targeted subsidies as well, right? So in terms of holistic planning, that aspect is also being covered to make sure that the overall society benefits from this transition.
Great, thank you. Jandos, then to you, how with renewable projects in Kazakhstan, you've told us that they've set years for these goals. By 2025, that's going to account for this much. By 2030, it'll account for that much. But Dr. Ichord makes a good point that subsidies for people are part of the problem. They keep the energy costs artificially low. How do you sell a renewable project to the public at the same time that you're trying to tell them that you're going to have to increase costs for energy use?
Of course, it is a complex problem. It is a problem not only with the, I would say, electricity, but also with gas and some other sources, which is very sensitive. Well, first of all, I would like to outline that our countries have a solid basis. Well, we have like legal framework in most of the countries, like up to date. For instance, in Kazakhstan and other countries of the region should be kind of aligning. We should align our policies, all of the countries, and kind of be on the same page in terms of, at least in terms of legal framework and regulation and other kinds of policies, in order to make a unified market in the region. And with joint positioning and attracting of the large companies jointly, because the large investors look at the large markets. And the market of Central Asia is, I would say, it's quite large. And if you take all the countries, and we need it to be balanced, and we need it to be kind of unified in terms of the rules in the various countries. And each country, I wouldn't say there is a competition. Lots of financing are available in the world, and we're perfectly aware of that. And there is no, I would say, competition, but we should be very fast on that in order to improve all this. And secondly, talking about the complex processes of social transformation in the region, and this energy transition, of course, correlates with the social transition and also social political transition in the region that all of these countries are experiencing. And of course, the government is considering the tariff issue is sensitive. It is, and all this energy transition and the people who work on the coal factories, in the mines, we have the entire region specialized, regions of Kazakhstan specialized in mining. So all of these jobs will be lost in the end. So we should plan all of this ahead, and this change should be gradual and steady, and well planned, I would say. And the last thing I would like to highlight is that international investors, they should be aware. We invite international investors to take advantage of these opportunities, of the conditions created in our region in terms of investment climate, in terms of regulation, in terms of commercial opportunity, and to actively invest in the region to develop the the system, because the Central Asian and Caspian region system is very important one in terms of integration of the East and West. And this entire region should play a large role, I would say, in the nearest future, 21st century.
Okay, thank you. All right, and in the approximately 8 minutes we have left, and I'm afraid that I might have missed something, so I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to make a last 2 or 3 minute comment on something that I might have missed that they think is important for our audience to know. And I'll start with Dr. Ichord.
Thank you. I've developed a long list, Bruce, so I will try to be concise if I can here. But there are a number of things I wanted to make sure I mentioned. One is the importance of digitalization and the modernization of the overall system management capabilities from both a regional and a national standpoint. It's still there's a lot to be done there, and it's not just modernizing SCADA systems. It's in a sense putting in wide area management systems, monitoring systems, and eventually control systems that allow you to deal with, in a sense, outage situations and other problems like we saw earlier in the region. And that's important. And CDC, Central Asia is working on trying to develop at least a wide area management system. Second point is, and it relates to my just energy transition, is with the expected growth of renewables in the region, countries need to be very much focused on the issue of what are the implications for the supply and local industry development and employment opportunities here. So, I mean, there's no reason why Kazakhstan and others can't develop those industries domestically that are going to have supply substantial content to these projects. So you're not into having to import everything for these projects. That's very important, given the magnitude of the investments that are occurring here, that both the government policies, business development, support local businesses and joint ventures that are going to allow some of that content to be produced locally. The third point was, let's not get too concerned about gas, even though there are those that in a sense say, you shouldn't develop new gas. I mean, we saw the IOC went ahead and approved this gas project because its role in the system. But remember that you've got Siemens and GE and others that are working on transition of gas systems to high content hydrogen. And you've got a region that has the potential for low cost green hydrogen development as electrolyzer prices fall. So that you've got that potential to eventually transition the gas systems to efficient hydrogen-based gas systems. So that really complements in many ways the renewable energy development. Third, I've been working a lot on small modular reactors. And I think in a sense, I am concerned when I see, in a sense, obviously the Russian Uzbekistan plans for big, large VVR 1000 reactor, 1200 reactors. I mean, I think that really the region should be looking and anticipating in the future as these SMRs become commercially viable, and if they clearly demonstrate that they can produce power for 60 years at a reasonably low cost, because it really solves that problem of having a stable base load that can also follow load, so that they're important. And so I would, and I know Kazakhstan is looking at options here for nuclear in the future. And then I think finally I'll stop by saying it's really important that there is a diversification especially in the hydro states, because I'm concerned about climate change and the impact it has on the water resource, and that's going to then affect very much the power sector as well as irrigation and other areas. And so I think that they're so highly dependent on hydro, and I'm including Georgia in this context as well, that they really need to look at how they can really expand the diversification so that they're not so dependent on hydro. But that means financial improvement in their systems.
Great, thank you. Azhar, what did I miss that our audience needs to know?
Bruce, quite honestly, nothing much, but I think Dr. Ichord mentioned this, that I think technology is advancing, right? So we talk about sort of carbon capture systems, they are rapidly evolving, right? So, a gas-fired plant would not, be a gas-fired plant in the next, whatever, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? So there will be, other sort of greener solutions, to fire up a typical gas-fired project as well. So technology is rapidly advancing. The countries also must keep a sharp eye on that what's happening. We as IFIs, we are also looking at very carefully at this rapid evolution. So that's one. And I'm going to again reinforce the point that, if you have consistent policies, transparent mechanisms to procure power, and get credible investors, that creates a sense of competition that brings you the best of technology, the best of financing, and the best of tariffs, right? So that aspect has to be kept in mind, that how do you structure your your regulations, your procurement policies to attract large credible investors, and have the requisite competition, right? So that you get the best outcome. So that's more of an underscoring of what we talked about earlier. But as we know, private sector is going to play a key role in this. So all these aspects are very important to attract that investment. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Azhar. Okay, and Jandos, last word to you. What does the audience need to know about renewable projects in Kazakhstan and potential for investment there in these projects?
Sure, I will be brief, very brief. So 3 things, of course, in Kazakhstan and some of the other countries of the region. So we created a clear rules of the game. It is very important, and we do realize that rules of the game, legal framework, policies, regulation, etc. So all of these should develop and should provide a transparent and clear conditions for everyone, both domestic and foreign investors, especially, I would say, the strategic investors. And the second one is infrastructure is the key, indeed. So more investment not only in facilities but also to infrastructure. It is mostly the job of the government, but also we have received, I would say, several good proposals for development of infrastructure as well as by the foreign investors of the modernization of the grids. And the production of, as Mr. Ichord mentioned, production of some of the parts locally would be a great thing, because it could make the projects more competitive. And we do have such projects like production of solar panels, wind turbines, and the towers for the wind stations. Also, they're pretty large and hard to transport. And also, we are setting the goal of producing the accumulators, electricity accumulators locally, since we have all of the raw material. And it is one of the goals that we have, considering the booming demand for electric vehicles globally. And the third one is, of course, the commercial availability should be considered by the government and by the private sector. Commercial availability is one of the important things here, and bringing the private investment and creating the conditions for investors. At least the equal clear rules is some of the great support.
Okay, thank you, Jandos. And we're going to have to conclude today's session, but a big thank you to the audience, of course. Thank you to Robert Ichord from the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Thank you to Azhar Iqbal Hussain, who's from the Infrastructure Group and the International Finance Corporation. Thank you, Jandos Temirgali, Deputy Chairman at Kazakh Invest. And a reminder that if you haven't already visited the Caspian Policy Center website, please do so. There's information on the topics that we've covered here, but also a wealth of information on other topics that have to do with the Caspian region. And they do produce a newsletter that comes out on a regular basis via email by some fine young writers. Appreciate you attending the meeting, appreciate the panelists for participating, and thank you very much. Have a good day.